Recently, Tamika Mallory was on The Breakfast Club, as many of you may already know, and of course she was caping for Joe Biden, which seems to be the regular thing with her now. But what was most interesting within that interview was when Charlemagne asked her about her thoughts on Kamala Harris saying that America is not a racist country, and she would go on to say this: "I voted for Joe Biden because of Kamala Harris being on the ticket. So I hold her more responsible than him. I have no expectations from a 70-plus-year-old white man. At all." Let me see if I'm hearing this clearly. According to Tamika's own words, she put a 70-year-old white man in office that she didn't even expect to do anything for black people, just so we can have a vice president in office who told you to your face that she wasn't going to do anything for black people?
So I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit black people. No.
This has to be one of the most politically immature and unintelligent responses that I have ever heard of why an individual chose to vote for somebody. In the same clip, even Charlemagne admitted to doing the same thing. And you know what the scary thing about all of this is? These are your black leaders. The world is changing and changing fast. The population of the dominant society is shrinking all across the globe and especially in America. But dwindling numbers doesn't automatically mean a loss of power. South Africa is the perfect example of that. But what it does mean in the case of America, a multi-ethnic nation, is that in order for the dominant society to maintain its power, it's going to have to rely on three things. Number one, the racial wealth gap is going to have to remain exactly how it is, extremely wide. Number two, controlled opposition. And number three, good old-fashioned sellouts who are simply looking for a comfortable position within an illegitimate system. Now, as it pertains to point one, the racial wealth gap is the Achilles heel of maintaining this illegitimate system of governance. You see, as long as the racial wealth gap remains as wide as it is, black Americans will always and forever be woefully dependent on the dominant society for their daily bread. Let's be clear. Money equals to power and options, which both go hand in hand. Without it, you can't even begin to seriously challenge the system. This is why conversations around closing the racial wealth gap never get more than simply a courtesy mention. Meanwhile, you are bombarded and inundated with story after story of issues surrounding criminal justice and police reform. I mean, think about it. They walked you from George Floyd to Ma'Khia Bryant in the same day. They didn't even give you a chance to take a breath before they triggered you with another situation. This is going to be the 10-year plan for black Americans in this country. You are about to waste your last politically relevant decade walking around in circles over police and criminal justice reform. Meanwhile, the racial wealth gap keeps getting wider and wider as our people are free falling to zero median net worth. But understand, for you to be this politically lost requires controlled opposition, an individual and or group that come to you under the guise of being grassroots while leading you to the slaughterhouse. And this is Tamika Mallory's role. And I already know what Tamika's supporters are going to say. Man, black folks love to tear one another down. We ain't never happy with nothing. We are our own worst enemies. Tamika is the queen of double speech. She will sit up here and tell you in the same breath that I understand that the Democratic Party has failed us over and over again. And in that same breath will tell you, but we're still not ready to separate from the Democratic Party, so we got to keep voting for them anyways. Now, I'm not going to sit up here and beat you over the head with this point because in my last live video, I spent about 15 minutes playing clip after clip after clip of her double speech. But you see, we're so blind and rage over police and criminal justice reform that most of our people can't even see that we're being walked off a political cliff despite it being so obvious. We are so easily impressed with one's ability to be an ambulance chaser who's always right there taking pictures with the victim's family and delivering speeches forever marching until freedom. Meanwhile, economically, we're turning into the Walking Dead out here. And none of your so-called black leaders are seriously addressing it. And the reason nobody is addressing it is because outside of controlled opposition, you have good old-fashioned sellouts like Simone Sanders, who's simply seeking a comfortable position in this illegitimate system of governance, working side by side with the devil himself. Now let's take a moment to watch this clip from brother Jamion J.B. Fowler, where he asked Simone Sanders, what is Joe Biden's plan to close the racial wealth gap between the descendants of American slavery who built this country and never received compensation for it and whites? Listen to how she walks him around the world just to give him a rising tide lifts all ships answer.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here. This is good.
Black Americans are 14% of the population in America, yet we own around 2.6% of the wealth in this nation. White Americans obviously own 90% of the wealth in this nation. Specifically here in South Carolina, medium household wealth amongst African Americans, particularly American descendants of slavery, is about $14,000, whereas white South Carolinians is about $133,000. Huge gap, right? I don't know that you can bridge that gap with broad and ambiguous programs for minorities or people of color or folks in the inner city. So what is Mr. Biden's plan to close that racial wealth gap?
Well, one, I will say that a lot of the issues that persist in the communities across the country, whether they're black communities, white communities, Latino communities, are institutional issues that are baked in. And when you talk about the gap, which I would like to actually call it a chasm between black Americans and white Americans when it comes to wealth, it's a chasm. But it's not, it is like, the economy doesn't just happen in a silo, for example. So there are educational things that have to do with that. There's infrastructure issues. There is, institutional racism. Slavery kind of set folks back, okay? Like, if we want to be frank. And so I would say, one, people often ask me, what is Joe Biden's plan for Black America? And as the Vice President has said, Black America's agenda is America's agenda. You can't have a health care plan that does not speak specifically to the plight of Black Americans. If it doesn't speak to the plight of people in America. So I guess the way I would answer your question is, if you look at each one of the plans we put out, whether it's our HBCU policy for minority serving institutions, HBCU policy for minority serving institutions, or our educational policy at whole that goes from 0 to 12, that accounts for tripling funding to Title I schools. Part of each one of our policies, I think, speaks to the broader goal and mission of closing that wealth gap. But when we talk about rebuilding America and rebuilding the middle class, we're talking about rewarding work again and not just wealth. Right now, rich people and the wealthiest people in this country are the ones getting the breaks. Just look at the tax plan that the Republicans passed about 2 years ago, okay? And so they told everybody that we was going to pass this tax plan and the corporations would get the kickback, and then that money would trickle down. It would trickle down to
Simone Sanders spent an entire campaign running cover for Joe Biden so he can secure the black vote, and she did it all for a press secretary job that she didn't even get. Instead, they gave her a do-nothing position called the senior advisor and chief spokesman to the vice president of the United States. How embarrassing is this? Yet these are our black leaders. You see, though those in the dominant society may be dwindling in numbers, they will still be the dominant society. The only difference is that now, with all the hype around inclusion going on, the faces of oppression won't look like the dominant society anymore. They'll look like you and me. And with all that being said, that does it for today's video. Please make sure you hit that subscribe button as well as the bell notification next to the subscribe button so you'll be notified whenever I release a new video. Also, make sure you text tdhiphop to number 33222. That's tdhiphop to number 33222. That way you'll get a direct text notification whenever I release a new video. But it also serves as a protection plan for myself in case YouTube ever gives this channel the axe. I'll be able to send you a direct link to where you can find me next. All social media links will be pinned in the comment section below. And last but certainly not least, if you have a love and appreciation for the work that I put in on this channel, as well as the work that I put in on TD News Network, my second channel, the number one way you can show your support is through Patreon. For only $3 a month, that will help put me in position to be able to take TD Hip Hop Media off of YouTube. Remember, the goal is not to grow big on YouTube, but to grow independent of YouTube. That leads to my very last point, and probably most important, is the emailing list. If you haven't done so already, please join the emailing list. The link will be pinned in the comment section below. There is no way that I can go independent of YouTube if I cannot take the YouTube audience with me. So it is extremely critical, if you haven't already, to please join the emailing list. And with all that being said, until the next video, peace.